So, your first time buying a franchise and you're looking for some advice from a couple experts here. This is what we do all the time. So, just to get started, someone just looking or even thinking about looking at franchises, it's their first time. Where do they start?
Yeah, so I think the important part is to do a self-evaluation to start the whole process, because at the end of the day, you really need to understand where you're at and then what you're looking to do in order to make any semblance of a good decision. And I think the first part of that is setting expectations properly and really making sure that you understand exactly what you're going to be looking at, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we tend to do with our clients, and we work with clients from, it's not only their first business, but their first major investment, maybe even just outside their home, all the way up to clients that, have had a long career, whether in real estate or, in the corporate world, and have a big, financial nest egg to dip into, but you need to evaluate exactly where you are. So, we try to help people understand not only where they are financially, but where they are on a professional journey, what type of aspects of their experience they can leverage into a new business. So we try to hash out what they actually can do and what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
With that professional experience.
Yeah, exactly. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said they had about $100,000 liquid. They were looking to invest in a franchise, and the first thing they wanted to do is be absentee, and they mentioned like McDonald's. So right away, I mean, McDonald's is going to be a way higher investment than just $100,000, and it's almost definitely not going to be absentee, at least not from the start, even if you buy something that's existing. You got to get acclimated into the system, and you can't just assume that you're not going to have any time invested with any system in general, with exception. But the assumption can't come in as like, oh, I have $100,000, I'm going to put it in, and I'm just going to get a check at the end of every month, and that's just how I'm going to live for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah, so that's a key factor. If it's your first time in general, you're really going to have, even with the franchisor's help, you're going to have to take time to not only learn the business, but learn business ownership. The franchisor is going to teach you a lot, but it's still different actually being out there, in the fray, taking bullets, right? Even if you've been running, a large team at a corporation, it is different when you're actually out there in the weeds, right?
For sure, yeah. So that's the part that we always like to talk with our clients is where you're at.
Yeah,
and set those expectations.
Yeah. And financially, I think a big one too is, I've talked to quite a few clients that say, hey, I think I need to make sure I'm making X amount of salary the first 6 months. It's not impossible to buy a franchise that way, but I would suggest understanding that you're probably not going to be want to taking a lot of cash off the business in that first period. And so you may either want to set your sights lower on a lower investment, or just simply just wait to make sure you have enough cash to, really make that jump full time, be ready for the, the first year kind of ups and downs, and not be pulling cash from that, newborn baby, so to speak, right? You just started it. So
yeah. And that also relates to setting expectation and goal setting, evaluating where you're at, because for instance, there's a brand that I was just talking to someone about, Schoolie Mitchell, right? Schoolie Mitchell is essentially a sales organization, and usually it's just a single owner operator with no employees. So you don't need to invest as much cash into that business, and you can pull some out because a lot of it is cold calling. There's not a ton of expense on marketing, and it's a sales gig. Like you're
Right.
buying a job, for lack of a better term, which isn't a bad thing if that's what you're looking to do. But to your point, if you're looking to actually build a business that has some equity, it's really difficult if you're taking money out of the business, because it needs, in order to grow, it needs to have capital to do so. So if you're taking it out, well, you're limiting how much it can grow. And if you're limiting how much it can grow, then it's not going to be as profitable. And so on and so forth. So as long as people understand, where they're at and what their goals are, it really helps the conversation as to what the best option is for you.
Yeah, and that's what we do. We try to evaluate, where you are and where you're looking to go, short term and long term, because obviously everyone wants to make as much money as they can short term and long term, but those things usually are in some balance, right? Not that you can't make a lot of money early and make more later, but it's harder because if you're pulling the cash out, you're not reinvesting in the future growth. So,
Exactly.
And that pigeons or kind of goes into how we approach finding options, right? When we find options for clients or help them. So if you're, after you've evaluated your goals, right, and have kind of an idea of expectations, then it's okay, how do we find some options that make sense?
Yeah. So I would say the first step in this process when I'm working with a client is I like to get an idea of what their skill sets are. Because not that you can't it's not that you can't buy a franchise that's outside of your immediate skill set, but it at least helps to understand where you're starting from. If you're somebody who has never been involved in sales once in their entire career, I would not recommend necessarily looking at a super high pressure sales driven business, because it's going to be a lot of learning curve. And hey, if that's something you want to take on, then okay, we can start to look at those options. But assuming you're looking ideally to make money with the business as quickly as possible and not build a whole new skill set, that's where I like to start with people, is say, like, okay, what do you do for work now? What's your background in? What are you comfortable with? And they can be general skills, they can be specific skills, but just painting that picture of who you are and what you bring to the table. That's what I like to do when I first start talking with somebody.
Yeah, and if this is your first time, there is going to be, regardless of whether you buy a franchise, you start your own business, you buy an existing business, however you do it, there's going to be some semblance of a learning curve. Mm-hmm. So having a basis of knowledge, whether, like you said, whether it's operations, logistics, sales, maybe even industry specific or something similar that you can draw on, is really going to help you as you navigate some of the other things that are going to come up. So having that base is a big deal. I agree when you're looking at options, is kind of using what you already know to leverage this new opportunity.
Yep. And then from there, I like to definitely factor in investment, right? Because we do want to do that. But I don't necessarily look at an investment as the only thing. Like, I don't like to keep a cap like, oh, we're going to stay under $150,000, because realistically, the investment is relative to the return and what you think you can do with the model. And just because something is a low investment doesn't necessarily mean it's better for any reason. And if you have something, just say your hypothetical range is, you tell me, oh, I'm looking to invest $150,000. Mm-hmm. That's plus or minus $50,000 to $100,000, because if you found something for $250,000 and it fits perfectly with what you're looking to do, and there's a lot of loan options for you, you don't want to kick that out.
Right.
And similarly, if you had your eyes set like, oh, I want to have a big business, I'm looking at, $1 million plus. It's like, well, there's a lot of businesses that we represent that you could start for $100,000 and build into $1 million business. So I factor in that initial investment, but it is more of a range, knowing that, we can talk through the numbers if a model makes the most sense, which is ultimately what I try to do, at least. Match.
I think the model needs to make more sense. And to your point, just because something's a lower investment doesn't mean you'll definitely get it back, because even low investment models and businesses can lose money, right? So it's not a guarantee because it's lower, it's going to be easier to get it back. Now, having said that, to your point, just because you can afford something doesn't mean you should invest it. And can is a loose word. Just because you can get approved for a loan and that's all your money doesn't mean you should do it.
Yeah.
Right. So, but to your point, I would rather be matched on what the model is, what the skill set is for the client. I think that's more important to understand especially if it's your first time. And then also, the competition in your particular market. So that's what we try to do and what people should do, especially if it's their first time. Another key point, in my opinion, I love emerging brands, which are, newer brands that, and maybe not newer, but on the smaller side. If it's your first time, I would suggest, and we suggest, trying to stay to either a more established brand, it's been around for some time with quite a bit of units, or at the very least, some sort of corporate entity or conglomerate to have that back end of experience. Because if it's your absolute first time owning a business and a franchise, there's going to be an extra learning curve that the franchisor is also riding. That is not the case with more established brands on average. Now, to our point, that doesn't mean you put those on the back burner, but I would start with more established brands and work my way down to find my matches. And we do that with clients very often. And it helps us compare and contrast, personalities of the client and then also of the brand. But I would suggest starting with options and franchisors that are a little bit larger, just to give you an idea of, what it's going to look like.
Yeah, and even if they look at a couple bigger brands for the sole purpose of during validation, hearing different ways you can be good at that brand. Because I know, coming from someone who was an emerging brand as in us, and also talking with a lot of emerging brands, they tend to have a sight set on here's the plan that we have in action and you execute and it works. And it's just not necessarily true. No. It may be true, but with a brand that has 300-400 units, they say, listen, like here's the playbook and here's how we, segment it for this type of starting capital. If you're in this market, here's what we do. They've seen things in so many different markets that they just bring a lot more experience to the table to tailor it specifically to your area. Because I can tell you, if you're in a service-based business, painting, something simple, if you are in LA, it's going to look a lot different than small town America in the Midwest, naturally. So
then Northeast, where there's cold weather in the real estate market. Very good point.
Throw variable
Huge
after variable.
Point. Yes, and that has to be understood. To even further double down on that point, people can check this out. McDonald's, arguably the most popular franchise brand ever, has different menus in international markets, right? The most established system we've ever seen, arguably one of the most successful, has different menus in different markets. So they even understand that. They have a system, but that system has to be adjusted based on the circumstance, based on the place. So very good point. That's one of the big benefits of an established brand with lots of infrastructure and lots of units. They've just seen it. They're not going to be surprised that, it's cold there. Wow, what do we do in January? No, we've already done that. We understand that. And you're not going to be at least the first guinea pig.
Exactly. So anything else on selection that you like to highlight?
No, I think being open-minded though, because it's more important to be with a brand that matches your skills, you feel is a good fit, and your investment levels than something that is quote unquote the hot brand. And I know that sounds, of course, that's logical, but people tend to get caught up in shiny new things. That's just and there's nothing wrong with that. And, if you're on one of those rides and you get it right, that's great. But if this is your first time, staying with that idea, I would suggest trying to not ride the wave, trying to be on something you really feel confident in. Not just the shiny new thing, right? So not being caught in, that's not as exciting as I thought. Say, no, it matches with what I want. That's something, at the very least, start investigating there, and then look at the other things. And you can always, most franchisees start with one and go to multiple, right? Especially, the more successful you are, you can be on the next shiny thing. But for your first one, start with the not as shiny objects, at least at the beginning, and work your way out from there.
Yeah, the open-mindedness thing is a really good point. I was just on a franchise advisor meeting, which is a part of our process today with somebody, and in our initial vision call, which is where we go over, what they're looking for, the goals that they have with the business, so it helps us to be able to find potential franchise fits. He mentioned that he had an interest in the health field, but wasn't married to it. But that was of a primary interest. And he tailored the conversation to be health focused. Now he's looking for his wife. And he mentioned that his wife also was going to be interested in being the face of the business and was really good at sales. So me, having the knowledge of the brands that I did bring some health brands to the table, but I also brought over some home service brands that are more sales oriented with a subcontractor labor model. Because with those types of businesses, you don't need to have a crazy amount of operational expertise or need to take that on with the business. It's essentially a sales organization that's within a specific industry, and you can be the face of the business, and it does involve sales. And when I presented it to him, there was two out of he liked three brands. One was a health brand, and the other two were actually home services that I guarantee would have never even thought to consider if he wasn't explained the model. And that's not because I did anything special aside from show him how the core of the model works. What is the responsibility of the owner? And he was open-minded enough to hear it. And then, lo and behold, 2 out of 3 options were way outside of what he was initially looking for.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a key point. Now, once you've then selected them, the next step is due diligence, right?
Yeah.
Where you actually start investigating them on an individual level and really vetting not only the brand but the opportunity relative to your area. So, if it's your first time, where should you start?
Yeah, and I was gonna do a little add in here because we've been talking about this recently, but in the franchise space, franchise brands call this process of learning about one another development, and Dylan and I actually kind of hate that because what are we developing here? It's due diligence on both sides. It's due diligence.
It's an investment.
Exactly. And so whenever you see, as a new potential franchise owner, as you're investigating, if you see the word development, take that out and just replace it with due diligence. I think it really helps to understand what that part of the process is meant for. But to go back into the first piece of due diligence that I would do is assuming that you have identified 2 brands that you want to investigate and you enter into development or due diligence. Before you even get on the first call, I recommend looking at the business model and trying to be as critical as possible and beat it up to generate questions. You don't necessarily want to come to the table guns blazing like, hey, how is this? What do you mean like this makes this? Like that's a little aggressive, but really pick apart the business model and develop a list of questions that you can come to the table on day 1 to say, hey, okay, just on a first look, here's what I have questions about. Because what that does is 2 things. 1, it gets you some good information, and it's vitally important to look at this business opportunity under a critical lens.
Yes.
But 2, it's a really good look for the brand, because remember, you are not necessarily being sold in this due diligence process. The brand's making sure that you're going to be a good fit for the system. And I actually just had someone who they didn't even get approved by the franchisor because they were taking their time on their validation calls, and it was like 2 weeks, and they hadn't called anybody. So they took that as a red flag that they weren't going to be a good fit for the system anyway. So they wound up ending the process. So a little side note to say, coming to the table with that list of questions immediately shows that you're an engaged and qualified candidate that's worth them talking to.
Yeah, we know what we call it, the rub. The rub is just a term for what's the part of the business that is added friction. What's the difficult part as the owner? Is there labor management problems? Is it sales? Is there a ton of competition? Does this maybe not work as well in certain markets as others? So to your point, bringing that does, first off, it allows you to quickly do your due diligence on not only the answers to those questions, usually financial or business model based, but on the people, because they should want that. They should. The good franchisors want a good amount of healthy skepticism, because if you're not skeptical, it means either 1, you're not serious, or 2, you are not qualified. And by 100%. Not qualified, meaning you're not the type of person to really take the time to make sure things are done right, that this is the right opportunity, that you're taking this with enough seriousness that it requires, especially if it's your first time. So like you said, you don't want to be Mr. Negative, but I'd much rather, and I encourage my clients to ask as many of those hard questions, because the good franchisors take that as, oh, this is someone really evaluating what it's actually going to be like to be successful. And that's critically important in that, again, development, we call it due diligence process, because that's what it is, and it's okay if those answers are not what you want. That just allows you and the brand to know, hey, this is not a good fit, let's move on to something else.
Exactly. Yep. And that kind of leads us into the second part, which is maybe a little bit tailoring off this first, but ask every question when the time comes for it to be asked. Meaning, in the due diligence process, there's usually a set number of calls, and each one is themed towards a specific aspect of the business. There's going to be a sales and marketing call. There's going to be an operations call. There's going to be a territory evaluation. If you have a question about your given territory, on the territory call, bring it up. Or if, as they're going through the information on the sales and marketing, if you have a question about how a specific marketing application works, ask it. Because first off, they probably want you to ask it again, because it shows that you're actually envisioning doing this. But realistically, like, if you're going to do this business model, you probably want to know what that is before you sign a check for $70,000 to the franchisor. So, like, don't not ask that question on being nice or cordial. Like, beat it up and actually ask the questions on the given call.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head. It's that ability to treat it like you are making a partnership, because that's what you technically are, right? And by making that investment, I mean, you're making a partnership, right? And with your business partner, you want to be able to bring it up on that moment, right? Because that you have to learn how to work that out together, even whether it's because it allows you to move off of that opportunity, or as you actually go through with that opportunity in franchise model, it allows you to kind of understand the dynamics of how that franchisor works, which is almost as important as, the financials, the business model, and the territory itself. Yeah, really good point.
And then the last piece of due diligence, of course, is validation. Validation is a period of time that you have as a prospective franchisee to be able to contact as many current franchisees as you'd like. All their contact information is listed in the FDD, so you have the chance to hear from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
What's your experience been? Here's what they're telling me. Is this how the marketing works? Is this how the sales work? How is operationally? What's it like managing and acquiring employees? Financial questions, maybe, how much money are you making? What are the margins? There's, obviously some people will answer that how they will, but you're able to ask that question or those questions during that validation period from arguably the most important person, the other people who are doing the business model that you're looking to do.
Yeah, and I always ask clients to work hand in hand with the franchisors for that, but at the end of the day, it is your due diligence process. So, the franchisors are going to do their best to give you contact info, but don't be afraid to just take that FDD and start reaching out to owners. You can't guarantee you're going to talk to everybody. And if you're having a problem talking to some people, they may just be busy, but bring it up to the franchisor, even if it's not who they recommended, because at the end, it's your money. You're the one that's going to be taking, on this risk. Don't be afraid to take that validation process in your own hands. And I've had a client, in fact, just a few months ago that, they had a validation call, and it wasn't that it was awful and that was the reason that swayed them, but it was an additional level of insight that made them say, we were a little bit on the fence. This pushed us in the right direction, meaning not onto that brand. And it was a validation call they did on their own, right, through the disclosure document. So don't be afraid to do that. And I think that's a big one. And we recommend clients as well to, once you get to that validation process and you really start talking about contracts, always bring in third-party counsel as much as you can. It can't hurt to have a fresh set of eyes, look at the, not only the franchise disclosure, but I definitely recommend getting an attorney involved, potentially having your accountant take a look at it. You can't overdo the amount of advice you get, right? And not everyone's going to be perfect advice, and not everyone's going to think it's the best option, but you always, you can't overdo advice, and you can't overdo talking to, validation with other franchisees.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Especially if it's your first time, because you're not going to be able to interpret it the way you may on your second, third, fourth, fifth acquisition. So don't be afraid to overdo it. There's never a rush. Even if you lose a territory, worst case, there's other franchisors out there. There's a lot of great options, and there's always new good ones coming out. So
yeah, it's better than rushing into a situation that you're not set up to do well in.
Yeah, 100%. So cool. Well, anything else for somebody buying on their first time?
No, I don't think so. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that just kind of summarize it. One, be very self-aware of what position you're currently in and where you want to go. It's very important to start the process with that in mind first. Second, keep an open mind for what you're looking at, because you never know what's going to be the best fit, because the business model is more important and the owner's responsibility than just the industry. And then third is do as much due diligence as possible, because you need to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and don't be afraid to bring in those third parties. Consultants like us, we can walk you through the whole process from, vision call, the franchise advisor meeting, all the way through due diligence, and then, next level professionals as well too, lawyers and accountants. So yeah, I think that covers it. So if it's your first time, good luck, and let us know how it goes. Absolutely. All right, guys, until the next one.